In September 1918, the Bolshevik government issued a decree that borrowed its very name from the French Revolution, a deliberate echo of the terror we already told you about. But this one had a different logic. In France, you died for what you'd done. In Russia, you died for what you were born into. Tonight, the systematic destruction of an entire class, one family, one estate, one execution at a time. Let's go back in time and see what happened. Petrograd, September 1918. 2 attacks on Bolshevik leadership, the assassination of secret police chief Moise Uritsky, and an assassination attempt that left Lenin himself seriously wounded, give the new government the justification it's been building toward for months. On September 5th, 1918, the Bolshevik government issued an official decree calling for what it bluntly termed mass shootings of class enemies. The man overseeing the Cheka, the secret police charged with carrying it out, was Felix Dzerzhinsky, and one of his lieutenants, Martin Latsis, described the entire philosophy in a single chilling sentence. The goal wasn't to find evidence of a crime. It was, in his words, to establish whether the accused belonged to the bourgeoisie as a class. That distinction is everything. Former Tsarist officers, police officials, aristocratic families, clergy, property owners, none of them needed to have personally opposed the Bolsheviks. Their birth, their title, their old profession was the charge and the verdict at once. In 1918 alone, roughly 15,000 people were executed under this logic. Historians' estimates for the full Red Terror period range enormously, from the tens of thousands the Cheka itself acknowledged to figures many times higher, depending on which years and which categories of violence get counted. And this didn't come from nowhere. The Bolsheviks openly modeled their campaign on the French Revolution's own terror, the same one that killed Marie Antoinette, Madame Roland, and the other women we told you about in a previous episode. They studied it. They saw a revolutionary government using systematic violence to consolidate power against an old aristocracy, and they built their own version of it, over a century later, with modern bureaucracy behind it. The first member of the Romanov family to die under this system wasn't Nicholas II. It was his younger brother, and he was killed months before the Red Terror was even officially declared. Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich had for one brief and strange day in March 1917 technically been the last emperor of Russia. Nicholas abdicated in his favor before Michael himself declined the throne, refusing to accept power without a popular mandate. By June 1918, he was under Bolshevik arrest in Perm, along with his British secretary, Nicholas Johnson. On the night of June 12th into the 13th, guards told Michael they were taking him to a railway crossing to board a train. He believed them. He and Johnson were walked into the woods outside the city. According to surviving accounts, the gunman opened fire. One gun misfired, wounding Johnson instead of killing Michael outright. In the chaos, Michael ran toward his secretary, arms outstretched, begging to say goodbye to him. Both men were then shot again at close range to finish it. There was no trial, no public announcement. The Bolsheviks simply reported that Michael had escaped. A cover story so useful that they would reuse a version of it for other Romanov murders in the months that followed. His body was never recovered. To this day, no one knows exactly where in that forest he died. One day after Nicholas II and his immediate family were killed in Yekaterinburg, a group of their relatives met an even more prolonged death, 60 miles away in a town called Alapayevsk. Elizabeth Feodorovna, known in her family as Ella, was the elder sister of Empress Alexandra and by 1918 had spent years as a nun, having founded a convent devoted entirely to charity work after the assassination of her own husband years earlier. She was, by every contemporary account, one of the gentlest members of the entire extended Romanov family. None of that mattered to the men who arrested her. On the night of July 18th, Ella, a fellow nun from her convent, and 5 Romanov relatives, including several young princes in their 20s, were taken to an abandoned, partially flooded mine shaft outside the town. Most of the group was beaten and thrown down the shaft alive. One of them, Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, resisted and was shot before being thrown in. When the guards realized their victims weren't dying quickly, they began throwing grenades down after them. Local legend holds that villagers could hear the survivors singing an Orthodox hymn from inside the mine for days afterward, a detail that has become central to how this story is remembered, and one that modern Russian historians researching the original investigation records have specifically challenged. Historian Ludmila Kulikova, examining the original 1918 forensic documentation, argues there's no contemporary evidence for the singing, and that later, more sympathetic accounts may have added it. What both versions agree on is the underlying brutality. This wasn't a quick execution. Whether or not anyone survived long enough to pray, they almost certainly survived long enough to suffer. Elizabeth Feodorovna's remains were eventually recovered by white forces that autumn, and after an extraordinary journey across a collapsing empire, through Siberia, into China, and finally to Jerusalem, she was formally canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1992 as a martyr. A statue of her now stands above the west door of Westminster Abbey in London, one of 10 20th-century Christian martyrs honored there. To understand what happened to Nicholas II and his family, you have to understand where they spent their final months, because the isolation itself was part of the design. By April 1918, the family was moved into a requisitioned merchant's house in Yekaterinburg that their captors bureaucratically renamed the House of Special Purpose. Its windows were painted over. A tall wooden fence, then a second fence beyond it, sealed the building off entirely from the street. Machine gun emplacements watched every angle. Nicholas once asked a guard why the family's daily walk in the courtyard was limited to a single hour. The answer, recorded in his own diary, so that it looks more like a prison to you. The guards' treatment of the family shifted noticeably depending on who was in charge. Under the earlier commandant, some guards had grown genuinely friendly with the family, playing cards, talking through the days. That changed when Yakov Yurovsky took command in early July, replacing the guard with men he considered more reliably loyal to the Bolshevik cause. Visits from the family's own physician were curtailed. A princess who tried to visit was turned away at gunpoint. By early June, they'd even stopped receiving newspapers. Total information isolation, layered on top of physical imprisonment. And yet, Nicholas's own diary from these final weeks reads almost eerily domestic. Complaints about a late dinner, quiet relief that his son Alexei was recovering from another bout of illness, a note marking his 50th birthday. Whatever the family understood about their actual situation, they spent their last months clinging to the small, ordinary rituals of a life that had already effectively ended. On the night of July 16th into the 17th, Yurovsky woke the family and told them they were being evacuated for their own safety. White forces, he said, were closing in on the city, and there had been gunfire in the streets. It took the family and their 4 remaining servants roughly half an hour to dress. They were led down into a small semi-basement room. At Nicholas's request, chairs were brought in for Alexandra and for Alexei, who could barely walk. Yurovsky read a short statement that attempts to rescue the family had failed and that the Ural Soviet had therefore decided they must be executed. Nicholas reportedly had time only to say "what" before the shooting began. What followed was not the swift, orderly execution Yurovsky had planned. Several of the guards, according to multiple accounts, had refused in advance to fire on the daughters, having spent months growing familiar with them. The squad that remained fired wildly in a cramped room thick with smoke. Jewels the family had sewn into their clothing for safekeeping deflected some of the first shots, prolonging the deaths of several of the children by several agonizing minutes. It took between 20 and 30 minutes to kill everyone in that room. Historians who've studied the event in detail are generally blunt about it. This wasn't an execution in any orderly legal sense. It was, in the words of one historian, an ugly, crazed, and botched murder. No trial, no charge, no defense for any of them. The bodies were driven to a remote mine outside the city, stripped, doused in acid to prevent identification, and buried in a shallow grave that wouldn't be properly located for decades. It was, in every sense, the same logic we've already described. Birth as verdict, carried out against the very family whose birth had defined the entire system the Bolsheviks were trying to destroy. Here's what's easy to miss if you only focus on the Romanovs. They were the most famous victims, not the only ones. The same logic that killed a Tsar's brother in a forest and a Tsar's sister-in-law in a mine shaft was, at the very same moment, running through every level of Russian aristocratic and professional life. The Soviet state gave this fate an official name, Bivshie Lyudi, former people. It wasn't an insult, it was a legal category, precisely defined in Soviet administrative documents to include former Tsarist officials, nobles, landowners, merchants, factory owners, and anyone else whose old status now marked them as an enemy of the new order. Being classified a former person came with concrete, immediate consequences. Ration cards were denied or downgraded to the lowest tier, sometimes below subsistence level. Voting rights disappeared entirely, a status Soviet law separately labeled lishenets, one who has been deprived. Children of former nobility found themselves barred from universities regardless of their own talent or record, punished for a birth they hadn't chosen. Family palaces and townhouses across Petrograd and Moscow were seized and carved up into communal apartments, with the family that had once owned the entire building now, if they were fortunate enough to remain at all, crowded into a single room of what used to be their own home. Two of Russia's most storied noble families, the Sheremetevs and the Golitsins, lived through exactly this collapse, palaces to shared rooms in the space of a few short years. The scale of what happened to this class is almost hard to comprehend. At the start of the 20th century, the Russian nobility numbered close to 1.9 million people. By 1921, as the Civil War wound down, no more than 50,000 former nobles remained inside Russia, roughly 12% of what had existed just years before. The rest had been killed, had fled into exile, or had simply vanished from any official record. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka himself, summed up the result with something close to satisfaction. The landowners as a class have disappeared, the bourgeoisie has been declassed, the political masters are now non-entities. Not every former person ended in a camp or an unmarked grave. Some quietly reinvented themselves, taken factory jobs, hiding their lineage from neighbors and even their own children, surviving by becoming, in every visible way, ordinary Soviet citizens. Survival itself often required erasing the very identity that had once defined an entire class. Historians still debate the full death toll of the Red Terror, with estimates ranging from the tens of thousands. The Cheka's own early records suggest up toward figures many times larger once the full Civil War period and every category of violence gets included. What's not in dispute is the shape of it, an entire class of people condemned collectively for what they were born into, in a system its own architects openly modeled on a revolution that had happened in France 125 years earlier. Two revolutions, over a century apart, reaching for the same tool. France executed people for what they represented. Russia executed people for what they were born as. A distinction that sounds small until you realize it meant a nun, a teenage prince, and a hemophiliac boy could all be sentenced by the same unappealable logic, alongside a Tsar who'd actually held power. The Bolsheviks studied the French Terror to build their own. History, it turns out, doesn't just repeat. Sometimes it's deliberately copied. Tell me which part of this hit hardest, Michael's forest, Ella's mineshaft, or the family in the basement? And if you want the full story on any of Russia's other revolutionary figures, you tell me which one. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time.